Now, tomorrow is Armistice Day, marking the end of the First World War in 1918. It will also be the 105th anniversary of the unveiling of the tomb of the Unknown Warrior in Westminster Abbey and the cenotaph in Whitehall, both of which serve as a symbol of remembrance for fallen soldiers whose remains have never been recovered. Well, John Nichol is a former RAF navigator, and his new book, The Unknown Warrior, charts the history of those whose bodies are never found from the Somme to Afghanistan. And John joins me now. John, good morning.
Morning, Hugo. Delighted to be with you as a long-term listener, so thanks for having me on.
Oh, lovely to have you on, John. Look, you served yourself. Why did you feel it was important to write a book about this topic in particular?
So I have been to Westminster Abbey on many occasions, Hugo, and many of your listeners will have seen the tomb of the Unknown Warrior, which sits at the entrance to the Abbey. It's the only tomb, and I think there's a couple of thousand in Westminster Abbey. It's the only tomb or memorial that nobody walks over. So when you see the Queen or the King walking in, they walk around it. And I have stood next to it, but never really understood the significance. And reading the stone, beneath this stone lies the body of. And I had not really realised the full implications and its history. And so I embarked on a journey going back to the Somme to try to track the journey of the Unknown Warrior. The base statistic is the shocker, Hugo. Mm-hmm. So over 1 million British Empire soldiers died during the First World War. And a century later, over 500,000 still have got no known grave. 500,000 missing, either buried unknown because they couldn't be identified or never found at all. And so for me, that was the starting point that sent me to the battlefields of the Somme to retrace that journey.
Tell us about the Reverend David Railton, who came up with the concept of the Unknown Warrior.
So David Railton was a battlefield padre, a priest, a vicar, as most people would call him. So he was serving on the front lines with the troops during the First World War. And it was a horror. His family allowed me access to his private diaries, his private letters. And he always talked about how he never wanted to bury one of his men unknown. They strove endlessly to bury them with a name and a known location. But even then, if you are buried with a known location, because of the horrors of the battlefield, because of the shift and flow, the ebb back and forwards, even soldiers who were buried, named with a grave, as the shells came down and the battlefields moved, they could be blasted from their resting places and scattered once again. They remained scattered. And so he talked about this, and he came up with this concept during the war, in actual fact, to have some sort of a memorial for the 500,000 families who had nowhere to grieve, nowhere to kneel beside and lay some flowers and say, my loved one is here. And it comes across in a letter that was written by a young boy who applied for tickets to the service of the unveiling of the burial and the unveiling at the cenotaph. And he wrote, he said, the man in that coffin might be my daddy. And that says it all. You don't need to know anything else. It's a place that represents them all. And it was his idea to do that.
How important, I mean, among military families, how important is it having remains of somebody who has fallen in conflict, of having a place to go, of having a sort of something to root the grief in? Because we can sometimes think of grief as being a more sort of a nebulous thing, but having some memorial, whether it's a gravestone, whether something else, I mean, it must just sort of be vital in processing the pain there.
People grieve in very different ways, and a couple of the stories that I use in the book to try to bring the story up to date, because we don't think of having people being lost now, but there was in the Falklands War was the classic example, and I wrote the story of a lady whose father was killed when HMS Coventry was bombed and sunk, and he went down on the ship, and they have nothing, they have no remains, they have no possessions. Everything he owned within his military career went down on the ship with him. And she just messaged me earlier today. And his name was Michael Fowler. And his great-grandson was at a remembrance parade. He's in the Cubs. And he was at a remembrance parade yesterday. And he said he was marching in memory of his great-granddad, Mike, who was looking down from the clouds. Because they have nowhere, his name is on a memorial in Portsmouth. But for them, the memorials, whether they're in Portsmouth, whether it's the tomb of the Unknown Warrior in Westminster Abbey, it is a place to go, to be there, to be present. And I spoke to a lady whose husband was killed in Afghanistan. and his body was brought home. And she talks about how important it is still now, and it was 15 years ago, that she can take their children who don't remember. His daughter was just a few months old when he was killed, but she can now go to his grave and kneel there or sit there and talk to her dead father. And she does. And so it's important that people have somewhere to go. His grief is processed in many different ways, Hugo. And the Unknown Warrior and those 500,000 people who had no known grave are the classic symbol of that.
I mean, so look, sort of a horrifying number of British servicemen died in Afghanistan, but it wasn't obviously of a par with the First World War. Is the phenomenon of the unknown soldier in warfare? I mean, that's sort of still going on. Is it still common in a war for there to be people, well, both people who die without there being remains that can be found, but also remains that can be found that people don't know who they belong to? That must be less common, one would have thought.
It would never happen within British armed forces today because of the identification system, because everybody knows everybody, because you are not. So go back to the Somme. On the first day of the Somme, the Battle of the Somme, 20,000 men died. 20,000 men died. And when you're trying to identify, bury, log, catalogue, terrible word, 20,000, you can understand how these things happen. That would never happen now. But it has happened in other conflicts. So the Falklands is the classic example. I spoke to a modern padre who buried the Argentinian dead, and he buried many of them unknown because they simply didn't have identification documents on them. And you can absolutely imagine, and Mark Ogden was just talking about the front lines in Ukraine. You could absolutely imagine, indeed we know that it could be happening with Russian troops. They're highly unlikely with Ukrainian troops, but Russian troops, because the care is not there, the knowledge, the means of logging it. So it would never happen to our forces, but certainly can happen to other forces today.
I mean, I must admit, I hadn't sort of quite put two and two together and realised that even the cenotaph, it itself is from the Greek for empty tomb. You know, that is precisely what the cenotaph is devoted to. How was it treated when it was first built, when it was first erected? Presumably, the public understood the need for a memorial like that in a much more visceral way than they might do today.
In the aftermath of the First World War, the grief was palpable across the nation, across the empire. So the cenotaph originally was just a wooden and plaster structure, a theatrical structure, really, built in 1919 for the march past, for what was then called the Victory Parade in summer 1919. And it was going to be torn down. And it was torn down, and there was no concept about it ever being replaced. But the outcry, because 1 million people went to see that temporary cenotaph in 1919 to mourn their loved ones. And so eventually they came up with the modern cenotaph that is there today, unveiled 105 years ago tomorrow. And I think when that was unveiled, 1.5 million people visited that within the first couple of months, walking from the new cenotaph in Whitehall all the way down to Westminster Abbey down Whitehall, and then visiting the tomb of the Unknown Warrior. It was crucial. Trying to put to bed the British grief.
Look, fascinating and moving as well. John Nichol, thank you so much. John's book, The Unknown Warrior, is out now. I believe it's available to order at the Times Bookshop, where Times Plus members can get a 20% discount. Visit timesbookshop.co.uk.